Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVDA Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan. We are back again, and this week we have a special guest with us, a gentleman from the West Virginia Department of Agriculture who focuses on invasive species and has been helping to get me information on where the spotted lanternfly is in West Virginia. And so I'd like to welcome James Watson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Karen.
All right, so we are getting a lot of reports now. The spotted lanternfly is making it across the state lines and starting to become more prevalent in this area. I know that it's been hitting Pittsburgh pretty hard for a while, but we're now starting to see it up in Weirton and up towards that northern tip of the Panhandle. Are there any other places in the Panhandle where it's been confirmed?
Good question. So in the northern Panhandle, West Virginia at present, we have Brooke County that's positive and Hancock County that's positive for spotted lanternfly. And the heaviest infestations in those two counties are around, as you mentioned, Weirton, specifically in the Route 22 corridor through Weirton, and then Fallensby, and then more into Hancock County. Chester and New Cumberland are the other areas of heavy infestation, but we're starting to get a lot of reports and observations of the pests kind of on the plateau. I'm referring to it as there, kind of between Route 30 and then south of that towards the PA line there. So kind of a rural setting, we're starting to get a lot of reports in that area as well. And those are probably coming over across from the PA line there from the east.
I know. So you were mentioning the West Virginia Northern Panhandle. On the Ohio side, which borders it on the other side, Jefferson County was one of the first counties that actually had a confirmed infestation. There was one last year, and there's one again this year. They found a pretty high population in the Mingo Junction area. Also, Mahoning County, just north of the West Virginia Panhandle there. But yeah, that Route 22, Route 30 corridor area, a lot of movement there. And James, some of the things that we're talking about, at least on the Ohio side, is how that spotted lanternfly seems to be really migrating through the rails, like through train tracks.
You're exactly correct. I mean, rail is a primary vector for the lanternfly to move from one location to another. I think that specifically in the area of Mingo Junction there, as far as West Virginia is concerned, I think we picked up outlying individuals that just literally came across the river with the wind movement predominantly being west to east there. But yes, you are correct in that rail is a primary vector for them. The population that we have there in Weirton proper, we do have reason to believe that probably was introduced via rail.
We have a lot of listeners in the Ohio Valley, but we also have a lot of listeners outside. What's the spread of spotted lanternfly looking like for the rest of the region?
Well, if there's one thing we've learned, at least in West Virginia, is, whatever prediction you make for where you think is going to be bad or not bad the next growing season, just plan for the opposite. Unfortunately, with this pest, that's just how it's been. But that being said, I think that there's two expectations that we have that more or less are going to play out. And that is areas that are close to transportation routes, be they rail or interstate, and have a lot of traffic being located in one spot, areas that have, major sporting events, festivals, things like that. Those are going to be areas that are predominantly going to be first to have an infestation. And then secondly, the other expectation is that areas that have more tree of heaven are going to be where the infestation blossoms, so to speak, and really picks up speed and has high intense numbers in the infested area.
Yeah, so speaking of the plants that they like, I know that because of how they feed, they have these piercing, sucking mouth parts where they basically stick a needle under the bark of the plant and suck the sap out of the plant. And so they prefer plants that have a really high sap flow, and that includes tree of heaven. But there's some other plants that have some fairly high sap flows as well, and our native grapevines and our cultivated grapevines are some of those plants. And so when you're out looking for these insects, looking for their egg masses, which is what you should be starting to do about this time of year, looking for them on Tree of Heaven and our grapevines, those are going to be two really key sites to keep an eye on, right?
Yes, that's correct. And unfortunately, there are some other species that they seem to be very fond of laying their egg masses on. That's not to say that they feed on these other species, but they do like the bark structure for laying their egg masses. And so some other species that we see a high density of egg masses on are black cherry, white oak, and shagbark hickory. So again, that's not to say that they feed on those species, but they really seem to like their bark structure. It kind of provides some shelter from the elements and such. So if you have a lot of black cherry, white oak, shagbark hickory, it's good to check those for egg masses throughout the winter season.
You know, you're talking about the tree of heaven with the high sap flow. Karen, you were mentioning that and how the spotted lanternfly taps into that, lets that sap run through its body, and then, you know, it kind of excretes the sugar that passes through its body after the first filtration of nutrients. We're talking about rails and things. And, you know, one of the things that you'll notice if you go through train tracks and railways is that because they're kind of disturbed habitats and, you know, they keep the vegetation back a certain amount of feet from the rails for safety and just for capability of the train itself. But, you know, you do see a lot of Atlanthus, which is tree of heaven, growing all through there, just in really close proximity to those rails. And I remember some seminars, some people from Pennsylvania that have been dealing with it for such a long time is, you know, not only does it prefer certain trees, but it also likes to lay eggs on like rusty surfaces. And then when you have like a prime feeding tree source there, and then you have these rusty trains that are moving and they'll sit for a long time as well. So if you have adults feeding on these, you know, these Atlanthus trees, and then they go over to the rail cars and lay their eggs on it, the car's not going to go right away. There might be a substantial amount of eggs when it does start moving, and whether it's days or weeks or whatever, you can see how it can actually move such a high population from one area to the other. Because like in Ohio, let's say, you know, we have 8 confirmed counties as of now that I know of, but they're not all clustered together. One is Hamilton County down in the southwest, and one is Mahoning County and Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland, kind of like towards the northeast. So you can see how like it would jump from one county to another just based on the, you know, the recipe that's there as far as like train tracks and Atlanthus trees.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. In addition to the ability to hitchhike on vehicular traffic, it's that, as you put it, recipe. It's that combination of ingredients, the habitat that's found along transportation corridors, be it rail or highway systems. It's just so conducive to spotted lanternfly survival. I mean, you have the host species there, the tree of heaven, you have a lot of objects, like you mentioned, rusted metal, rock outcroppings, things like that, where they have good surfaces to put their egg masses on. And then, of course, they have a ready-made mode of transportation to move to the next spot. So it's just a perfect storm, so to speak.
So now, James, can you tell us a little bit about why spotted lanternfly is such a big deal?
Sure. So in my opinion, there's 3 major areas of why spotted lanternfly is a big topic. One is the potential to damage agricultural crops by sucking sap out of the crop. And specifically there's a lot of concern about cultivated grapes and hops. Secondly, the potential damage to forests trees and forest plants. We're concerned about wild grapes, Virginia creeper, silver and red maples, and black walnut. Many people would know black walnut's a very important tree in our forest, both ecologically as well as economically. And then thirdly, there's what I like to refer to as the aesthetics of it. And what I mean by aesthetics is, we have some pests that are very problematic and certainly cause a lot of damage, but they tend to stay in the plants more and they don't really interact as much with people. And so people that don't really care about plants or forestry, they are, so to speak, okay with it. But that's not the case with spotted lanternfly. I mean, spotted lanternfly gets up close and personal with everyone. I mean, it crawls all over your vehicles and your houses and your businesses, flies at you when you're walking outside, you're trying to enjoy a game, things like that. And so even those individuals that could care less, unfortunately, about agriculture or forestry, they're really disturbed about, this insect pest and how it affects their daily routine. So that's what I mean by the aesthetics of the pest as well. So those three areas are, I think why this pest has such a priority and a topic in general right now.
Yeah, I have relatives that live over in the Philadelphia area on the outskirts. And when spotted lanternfly was first really big over there, it was a continual fight just to keep them out of the house. They would hang on the dogs and they would climb up the door frames. And additionally, there was as Dan said earlier, the excretions. They drink so much sap that some of that sugary stuff comes through their system and lands on your porch steps or your car or on plant leaves. And the problem with that is A, it's fairly slippery. B, it's fairly sticky and it's hard to wash off. And C, if you get enough of it on plant leaves, it'll actually form a sooty mold. A mold will grow in it, which will block the ability of those leaves to photosynthesize. And that is an additional stress on our potential horticultural or food crops.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you think about this, you have hundreds of these fairly large leafhoppers, right? The leafhopper is just a category of insects of the spotted lanternfly. And they're tapping into the sap, it's going through their body, and they're excreting the waste, which is, some people refer to it as honeydew. And then, like Karen was saying, then that sticky substance then attracts mold. Then you get sooty mold growing and it becomes slippery. But it also brings in other insects like wasps and yellow jackets, all that mold growth. If you think about, like, if you have an orchard, right, and you want to keep your plants clean, you spend a lot of money on fungicides and on bactericides. And, you're just making sure that the plant can photosynthesize, produce those sugars and put them in the fruit because that's where we want them. So you start getting these stressors and like this disease pressure that you didn't have before. So even if it doesn't necessarily take out a tree or a grapevine, what it's going to cause is, at minimum, is going to cause a diminish in fruit production. And more than likely, it'll also cause disease pressure, and it could cause a decline to the entire orchard or vineyard. Just can't keep up with the disease and go out of business. It's one of those unexpected issues that people didn't see 5 years ago. And now it's just right in your face. And when it's a problem, it's so intense that I think it really is going to impact orchards and vineyards from here on out as that spotted lanternfly goes across the state.
Exactly. And what you're referencing there, especially with the excrement and the sooty mold that grows on it, that's what we refer to as the indirect negative effects of spotted lanternfly infestations. I've been in stands where there's a lot of invasive Japanese barberry in the understory. That's a very bad invasive plant and one that we typically think is very difficult to control, in a forested setting. And I can say, I've seen Japanese barberry of all things, and Japanese stiltgrass for that matter, actually dying from all of the honeydew that's, been dropped on them from the feeding of the spotted lanternflies, that are in the tree of heaven above those barberry and stiltgrass. So the fact that it kills those invasive plants like barberry just illustrates the impact that a lot of that excrement will have on native desirable understory plants in the forest, grapes, fruits that are growing underneath forest edges, fence rows where the tree of heaven overhang them, things like that.
Oh, so that's really going to cause more stress on our understory plants, and that's not a good thing. So what can people do? What should people be doing in the fall of the year to help reduce the impact of this insect?
Good question. So right now is still a really good time to be controlling tree of heaven. By controlling tree of heaven, we can help to decrease the populations of spotted lanternfly and also minimize those indirect impacts of the spotted lanternfly feeding that we had just discussed. So we encourage landowners to learn to identify tree of heaven, make sure you're not confusing it with other similar looking species like black walnut and staghorn sumac, and remove that from the property. And in addition to removing it, it's important to treat it with herbicide. Depending on the setting, the tree of heaven doesn't have to be removed completely. We just usually put that word in the removal to prevent landowners from simply spraying a herbicide on the tree of heaven and killing it, and then creating a hazard tree that could, fall on a tree stand or across the road or in the power lines. But if the tree of heaven is in an area where having a large dead tree is not going to create a hazard, it can be killed this time of the year by simply doing a basal bark application of herbicide on the bottom 18 inches of the tree stem, all the way around, wetting it not to where it's running off, but where it's thoroughly moist, and then those trees will die. So it's just important to remember that herbicide has to be included in the removal process of tree of heaven. Otherwise, it's going to resprout worse than ever if it's simply just cut off and the stumps are left untreated.
Yeah, that's a problem we've found with tree of heaven and Japanese knotweed. If you're just cutting it, you're making your problem worse. You have to use an herbicide to treat that plant. And if you have questions on how to identify tree of heaven, so that you can confirm you are taking care of the correct species, and application techniques such as hack and squirt or basal bark spray, and what chemicals you should use, please reach out to your local extension office. Every state has different pesticide rules and regulations, so please make sure that you are using something that's going to work appropriately, that you have the right carrier, and that you are applying it at the right rate for effective control. Because like we said, if you don't do it the correct way, you may just be making the problem worse.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about that, because if you've never done basal bark treatment, you're not working with water, you're working with oils, and there is a special way to do it. Concentrations are different, but it is a great method to get control of certain woody type species like tree of heaven. I know it's used a lot in autumn olive. Even though autumn olive doesn't seem to be a spotted lanternfly favorite, it's still a nuisance nonetheless. But please, get that information before you start going out there. And it's not that it's difficult, but we also don't want you to get discouraged either. So great time to getting rid of those ailanthus trees. Being in Belmont County hasn't been officially confirmed in this area yet, but Jefferson County is right there. Just
Yeah.
It's just on the verge of being here, and it's going to be in everybody's faces very soon.
Yeah, we've had several people contact us saying, hey, I saw one, but it was moving too fast. I couldn't get a picture. And so we haven't had the confirmation of an established colony yet, but we've had a couple people that have seen the adults flying around. So one of the things that the social media is going crazy with right now is different ways to, let's say, destroy this horrible pest, right? And so some of the ideas out there are pretty crazy. And so can you go over some of the effective and approved methods for controlling or trapping the spotted lanternfly? What works, what maybe doesn't work?
Sure. So we'll go over recommendations first, and then some of the things that should not be done. So pesticides are very effective at controlling the spotted lanternfly, I want to stress, first of all, it's very important to read the label to make sure that it's an appropriate product for where you're going to be using it and what you're going to be using it on. So we're talking about the amount of time before you can eat a fruit or something that you've applied the pesticide. So it's very important to follow the label, make sure you know where you're putting the pesticide and if it's appropriate or not. And then also to make sure that you are applying the pesticide appropriately. So read the label first, preferably before you purchase the product. Those labels are available online before purchase to make sure it's what you need. And it's good to make sure that the pesticide includes recommended active ingredients that are effective at killing spotted lanternfly. And so some active ingredients that are, good for controlling spotted lanternfly that are contact insecticides are carbaryl, bifenthrin, and what I mean by contact insecticides is simply that these insecticides work by killing the insect on contact. Then there are systemic insecticides such as the active ingredients dinetefuron and imidacloprid, and these work by having the plant take up the pesticide once it's applied to the plant, and then when the insects feed on the plant, they will decline and eventually die. So, of course, the contact insecticides, they're useful on plants, but they're also useful on non-organic surfaces as well. So, pesticides are very useful. Just make sure you read the label before you purchase, make sure it has the active ingredients that are recommended, and make sure you know if it's appropriate to where you want to apply it as well. And then there are some non-pesticide methods of control as well. A lot of people like to use sticky bands. They put those around the structures or tree stems to capture spotted lanternfly nymphs. In particular, it has been found that non-target species have been able to become stuck on those as well. So it's important to put some mesh around that to keep birds, bats, things like that away from the sticky surface of those bands. But those have been highly effective in many settings, especially where pesticides are not desired. And then it's important to look for the egg masses during the winter season. So egg mass season is from November through April in our area. And so when you find those egg masses out there on whatever surface they're on, you want to smash those egg masses. I like to say smash instead of scrape because some research has been a little bit inconclusive when you scrape the egg mass, whether or not the eggs that are scraped off and fall on the ground, they may still be viable. So if you smash the egg mass, you know for sure that those eggs, they're dead. So smashing the egg masses in the winter months is another good mechanism for controlling the pests that does not involve the use of pesticides. And if you have a lot of these insects on your porch or somewhere like that, a non-pesticide contact solution would just be to use dish soap solution. So if you have a solution that contains at least 10% dish soap and 90% water, that's a good way to control these pests if they're just on a surface like your porch or your sidewalk, places like that. You just spray it with that solution. And again, though, that's a contact method. And then, of course, removing the tree of heaven. That's really, really important at reducing the populations. So those are recommendations. Some things you want to be careful about. There's a lot of homemade concoctions, so to speak. They're aimed, obviously, at encouraging people to be able to look in their cupboard or their closet and get some ingredients out and mix some things together, that everybody has sitting around their house and spray those on the insects. And although that sounds wonderful, a lot of times, those recipes or that advice that's floating around on the internet is not taking into consideration the efficacy, and also very important, it's not taking into consideration the damage that it can do to the environment. So, for example, there's recommendations out there to use diesel fuel to kill spotted lanternfly. Well, yes, diesel fuel can kill spotted lanternfly, but unfortunately, it also will have a bad effect on the environment and on other species as well. So it's not recommended to use diesel fuel to kill spotted lanternfly, as well as a lot of other cleaning solutions. Even foods, certain foods that are recommended, those can be detrimental to plant growth. It can cause phytotoxicity, which is essentially death to the plants that it's sprayed on. So even though something might be okay for a human to eat, it might not be a good idea to spray it all over leaves of your favorite plant in front of your porch. So it's just good to, stick with the recommendations. Don't succumb to advice on the internet without researching it first to make sure that that's not going to be harmful to the environment or the plants. So that's some recommended advice, and also some things that we encourage the public to stay away from.
If you are looking for a good resource for really good information on how to build spotted lanternfly traps, how to treat spotted lanternfly to kill it, or how to protect your crops, Penn State Extension has done a fantastic job of researching and developing outreach materials. So as always, we tell you search site:/.edu. So if you search for spotted lanternfly Penn State, you'll get a lot of really great information. They've done the testing, they've made sure that they've mitigated environmental impacts, and they've also made sure it actually works. So that's a really great opportunity. But before we let you go, James, please tell our listeners where to go if they do spot spotted lanternfly.
Sure thing. So we do ask the public to report spotted lanternfly, even if your county is infested with spotted lanternfly and you look at the map and you say, oh, I don't need to report it anymore, my county's infested. We still want people to report it because that helps us with several things. It helps us to not only delineate existing populations, but it also helps us to focus in and target areas that have higher numbers of the pest. So if we see, a particular municipality, we get a lot of reports from there. We can get some staff out there to see what's going on. We'll look at some high traffic priority locations for possible treatment, things like that. So it's important to report it. If you get a response back that your county's positive or whatever, it's not that, that we don't care or don't appreciate your report. It's still helpful. And we do ask that you do that. And so how do you report? Well, you report to our agency, the West Virginia Department of Agriculture, and you can do that via email at bugbusters@wvda.us. And then when you submit your report, it's important, if possible, to have a picture of the insect that you found. And that way we can also help you know for sure if it's, spotted lanternfly or something else. So try to include a picture when you report at bugbusters@wvda.us.
Great. And that's BUGBUSTERS. That's so Bug Busters. So for those of you who are not in West Virginia, contact your state's Department of Agriculture and let them know. And as it is spreading, we're all going to get a nice taste of this, just like brown marmorated stink bug, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So we need to learn to deal with this and manage it effectively. And we are still learning every day. I mean, that's the glory of science. We're always testing and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. James, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome. Glad to have been able to be on.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.